live. He turned from the sun to his shadowing cabin, and for a moment a ghost of a smile played in his face as he heard the little mother mouse rustling among her papers. "We can't do it," he said. "We simply can't do it, Mrs. Captain Kidd. She's had hell enough without me taking her into another. And it'd be that, sooner or later. It sure would, Mrs. Captain Kidd. But I'm glad, mighty glad, to think she'd let me kiss her if I wanted to. Think of that, Mrs. Captain Kidd, if I wanted to! Oh, Lord!" And the humor of it crept in alongside the tragedy in Jolly Roger's heart, and he chuckled as he bent over his partridge breasts. "If I wanted to," he repeated. "Why, if I had a life to give, I'd give it to kiss her just once. But as it happens, Mrs. Captain Kidd—" Jolly Roger's breath cut itself suddenly short, and for an instant he grew tense as he bent over the stove. His philosophy had taught him one thing above all others, that he was a survival of the fittest only so long as he survived. And he was always guarding against the end. His brain was keen, his ears quick, and every fiber in him trained to its duty of watchfulness. And he knew, without turning his head, that someone was standing in the doorway behind him. There had come a faint noise, a shadowing of the fading sun-glow on the wall, the electrical disturbance of another presence, gazing at him quietly, without motion, and without sound. After that first telegraphic shock of warning, he stabbed his fork into a partridge breast, flopped it over, chuckled loudly, and then with a lightning movement was facing the door, his .44 Colt leveled waist-high at the intruder. Almost in the same movement his gun arm dropped limply to his side. "Well, I'll be—" He stared, and the face in the doorway stared back at him. "Nada!" he gasped. "Good Lord! I thought—" He swallowed as he tried to lie. "I thought—it might be a bear!" He did not, at first, see that the slim, calico-dressed little figure of Jed Hawkins' foster girl was almost dripping wet. Her blue eyes were shining at him, wide and startled. Her cheeks were flushed. A strange look had frozen on her parted red lips, and her hair was falling loose in a cloud of curling brown tresses about her shoulders. Jolly Roger, dreaming of her in his insane happiness of a few minutes ago, sensed nothing beyond the beauty and the unexpectedness of her in this first moment. Then, swiftly, he saw the other thing. The last glow of the sun glistened in her wet hair, her dress was sodden and clinging, and little pools of water were widening slowly about her ragged shoes. These things he might have expected, for she had to cross the creek. But it was the look in her eyes that startled him, as she stood there with Peter, the mongrel pup, clasped tightly in her arms. "Nada, what's happened?" he asked, laying his gun on the table. "You fell in the creek—" It's Peter," she cried, with a sobbing break in her voice. "We come on Jed Hawkins when he was diggin' up some of his whiskey, and he was mad, and pulled my hair, and Peter bit him. And then he picked up Peter and threw him against a rock, and he's terribly hurt. Oh, Mister Jolly Roger!" She held out the pup to him, and Peter whimpered as Jolly Roger took his wiry little face between his hands and then lifted him gently. The girl was sobbing, with passionate little catches in her breath, but there were no tears in her eyes as they turned for an instant from Peter to the gun on the table. "If I'd had that," she cried, "I'd have killed him." Jolly Roger's face was coldly gray as he knelt down on the floor and bent over Peter. He pulled your hair, you say?" "I forgot," she whispered, close at his shoulder. "I wasn't going to tell you that. But it didn't hurt. It was Peter. He felt the damp caress of her curls upon his neck as she bent over him. "Please tell me, Mr. Jolly Roger, is he hurt bad?" With the tenderness of a woman Jolly Roger worked his fingers over Peter's scrawny little body. And Peter, whimpering softly, felt the infinite consolation of their touch. He was no longer afraid of Jed Hawkins, or of pain, or of death. The soul of a dog is simple in its measurement of blessings, and to Peter it was a great happiness to lie here, broken and in pain, with the face of his beloved mistress over him, and Jolly Roger's hands working to mend his hurt. He whimpered when Jolly Roger found the broken place, and he cried out like a little child when there came the sudden quick snapping of a bone, but even then he turned his head so that he could thrust out his hot tongue against the back of his man friend's hand. And Jolly Roger, as he worked, was giving instructions to the girl, who was quick as a bird to bring him cloth which she tore into bandages, so that at the end of 10 minutes Peter's right hind leg was trussed up so tightly that it was as stiff and as useless as a piece of wood. "His hip was dislocated, and his leg bone broken," said Jolly Roger when he had finished. "He is all right now, and inside of 3 weeks will be on his feet again." He lifted Peter gently and made him a nest among the blankets in his bunk. And then, still with that strange, gray look in his face, he turned to Nada. She was standing partly facing the door, her eyes straight on him. And Jolly Roger saw in them that wonderful something which had given his storm-beaten soul a glimpse of paradise earlier that day. They were blue, so blue that he had never seen violets like them, and he knew that in her heart there was no guile behind which she could hide the secret they were betraying. A yearning such as had never before come into his life urged him to open his arms to her, and he knew that she would have come into them, but a still mightier will held them tense and throbbing at his side. Her cheeks were aflame as she looked at him, and he told himself that God could not have made a lovelier thing, as she stood there in her worn dress and her ragged shoes, with that light of glory in her face, and her damp hair waving and curling about her in the last light of the day. "I knew you'd fix him, Mr. Roger," she whispered, a great pride and faith and worship in the low thrill of her voice. "I knew it!" Something choked Jolly Roger, and he turned to the stove and began spearing the crisp brown potatoes on the end of a fork. And he said, with his back toward her, "You came just in time for supper, Nada. We'll eat, and then I'll go home with you as far as the ridge." Peter watched them. His pain was gone, and it was nice and comfortable in Jolly Roger's blanket, and with his whiskered face on his forepaws, his bright eyes followed every movement of these two who so completely made up his world. He heard that sweet little laugh which came only now and then from Nada's lips, when for a moment she was happy. He saw her shake out her hair in the glow of the lamp which Jolly Roger lighted, and he observed Jolly Roger standing at the stove, looking at her as she did it, a worship in his face which changed the instant her eyes turned toward him. In Peter's active little brain this gave birth to nothing of definite understanding, except that in it all he sensed happiness. For somehow there was always that feeling when they were with Jolly Roger, no matter whether the sun was shining or the day was dark and filled with gloom. Many times in his short life he had seen grief and tears in Nada's face, and had seen her cringe and hide herself at the vile cursing and witch-like voice of the man and woman back in the other cabin. But there was nothing like that in Jolly Roger's company. He had 2 eyes, and he was not always cursing, and he did not pull Nada's hair, and Peter loved him from the bottom of his soul. And he knew that his mistress loved him, for she had told him so, and there was always a different look in her eyes when she was with Jolly Roger,
and it was only then that she laughed in that glad little way.